17, her stepsister came to ruin her engagement, but the Alpha King didn't let that happen. The scent of decaying leather and dried rabbit skin glue filled the lowest levels of the Obsidian Citadel, settling heavily into the freezing air that pooled near the stone floor. Nellie sat alone at a long, scarred oak table, her fingers stained with dark iron gall ink and yellowed beeswax. She held a rusted iron needle, carefully guiding a thick linen cord through the broken spine of a 300-year-old territorial tax registry. The heavy brass weights placed on either side of the parchment kept the fragile pages from curling in the damp, relentless northern draft that seeped through the fortress walls. She pulled the thread taut against the pad of her thumb, testing the tension until the harsh, biting friction of the fibers threatened to cut into her skin. The slight, stinging burn was a deliberate grounding mechanism, a sharp physical reminder that her world remained measurable, predictable, and bound by absolute rules. This sprawling archive was her sanctuary, a subterranean fortress, built of stacked ledgers, rolled maps, and sealed blood treaties inherited from her late father. Edwin Vance had spent his entire life cataloguing the legal foundations of the sovereign wolf packs, prioritizing the preservation of written truth over the fleeting, chaotic politics of the court above. Now that he was gone, those same politics threatened to scatter his life's work to opportunistic scavengers. Distant relatives and rogue land bursars were already circling the estate, viewing the ancient registries not as history, but as tools to forge claims and steal borders. Nellie pressed the flat of her hand against the cold, cracked leather cover of the restored book, verifying the stability of the binding. She had learned long ago that weeping offered no strategic advantage in a world governed by ink and iron. Tears would not secure the heavy oak doors of this library, nor would they legally bind the estate to her name before the hostile council. Only a formal alliance with the crown could provide that level of structural protection. The political betrothal to King Alistair Sterling was merely hours away, an event that would violently shift her existence from this quiet obscurity into the merciless, scrutinizing light of the High Court. She picked up a small, stiff-bristled brush, carefully applying a thin layer of paste to seal the exposed knots of the spine. The quiet, methodical labor slowed her breathing, anchoring her racing pulse to the steady, repetitive rhythm of the work. Every stitch she placed in the ancient parchment felt like a practice run for the suffocating composure she would need to survive the evening. She wiped her hands clean on a rough linen cloth, leaving the drying book under the brass weights, and prepared to walk up the spiraling stone stairs toward the sovereign chambers. The heavy silver gown she wore that evening did not belong to her. It was a stiff, collared ceremonial garment, pulled from the depths of the royal wardrobe, weighed down with metallic embroidery and seed pearls that felt more like chainmail than silk. Standing before a clouded glass mirror in the freezing antechamber, she dismissed the hovering attendants with a quiet, polite nod, preferring the absolute safety of isolation. The heavy fabric did not drape comfortably across her slight frame. It enclosed her, forcing her spine into an unnaturally rigid, vertical posture. The high collar pressed against her throat like a warning, a physical manifestation of the suffocating hierarchy she was about to step into. It was an awkward, heavy garment, but it served perfectly as a shield against the inevitable stares of the elite. Their arrangement was strictly transactional. The parameters were rigidly defined, a fleeting union devoid of romantic attachment, intrusive inquiries, or blurred lines of intimacy. Alistair was a man who governed his pack through meticulous administrative precision, relying on strict legalism and unyielding procedure rather than the brute, possessive dominance common among other alphas. He required a politically unproblematic consort from a respectable historical lineage to quiet the restless factions of the Northern Council. In exchange, she would receive the supreme legal authority of his sovereign name, a permanent, undeniable shield that would lock her family's greedy hands out of the royal archives forever. She smoothed her palms down the stiff silver skirt, appreciating the absolute clarity of the transaction. There was no pretense of romance or fated destiny here, only a mutual, highly calculated recognition of utility. A loose silver thread dangled erratically from the rigid cuff of her left sleeve, catching the dim amber light of the wall sconces. A typical noblewoman preparing for a betrothal banquet might have rung a silver bell to summon a maid, perhaps staging a minor, theatrical fit over the imperfection. Instead, the quiet archivist reached into the hidden pocket of her heavy underskirt and withdrew a smooth, polished bone folder. It was the exact tool she used to crease stubborn parchment and flatten dog-eared maps in the library below. Holding her breath to steady her hand, she used the flat edge of the bone to carefully tuck the frayed wire back into the tight, heavy seam. She pressed the fabric flat against her wrist, smoothing the edge repeatedly until the flaw vanished completely into the metallic weave. Satisfied, she slipped the tool back into her pocket, letting the silence of the room settle over her shoulders before turning to face the heavy iron doors that led toward the great court. The grand banquet that followed the private signing was less a celebration and more an exercise in structural endurance. The ancient fortress did not lend itself to soft romance. Its high vaulted stone ceiling trapped the cold northern wind, echoing it back down into the great hall where beeswax candles struggled against the encroaching shadows. There were no musicians in the gallery, no floral garlands strung across the high-backed oak chairs. Instead, the perimeter was lined with recording scribes, their quills scratching across thick parchment. The court of the Alpha King functioned as a highly precise administrative bureaucracy, a machine of law rather than a stage for grandiosity. At the center of the dais, Nellie sat rigidly in her borrowed silver gown, her hands folded neatly in her lap to hide her cracked knuckles. The stiff collar dug into her neck, a constant reminder of the transaction she had agreed to. Beside her, Alistair occupied his carved seat with statuesque stillness. He did not fidget or adjust his heavy velvet cloak. He simply watched the assembly with the calm, predatory focus of a man who knew the exact location of every ledger and treaty in his kingdom. Before them stood High Chancellor Robert Mercer, holding a scroll of thick vellum. Robert was a precise, strictly neutral court bureaucrat who valued protocol above all else. His spectacles reflected the amber candlelight as he began to read the official betrothal decree aloud to the assembled nobility. The document was an exhaustive catalogue of clauses, cementing the alliance between the sovereign administrative house and the legacy of the late Edwin Vance. It detailed the transfer of archival protection and the boundary lines of inherited lands. Furthermore, in accordance with the sovereign cartularies, this union guarantees the inviolable sovereignty of the Vance historical collections. Robert read, his voice projecting across the hall. He turned a page, adjusting his grip on the parchment, subject to the jurisdictional oversight of the pre-provincial. The Chancellor hesitated. When he attempted the long-winded legal term detailing ancient land rights, his voice cracked slightly, the sound echoing awkwardly against the cold stone walls. Alistair did not look at the older man. He merely lifted his right hand from the carved armrest and let his heavy iron signet ring drop against the polished wood. Clack. It was a single, nearly imperceptible tap. But in the acoustic geometry of the citadel, the sharp metallic sound cut through the air like a blade. Robert stopped instantly. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and repeated the term with flawless articulation. Nellie let that knowledge settle into her, like cold water into stone. The Alpha King did not need to shout to command a room. His power was demonstrated through restraint, through the absolute certainty that his laws governed the air they breathed. He corrected the flow of an empire with a millimeter of movement. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, finding solidifying comfort in his clinical attention to detail. The rhythmic scratching of the scribe's quills resumed. The Chancellor reached the final paragraph of the decree, preparing to formalize the binding clauses that would permanently close the matter of her guardianship. Nellie allowed herself a shallow breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders uncoil. The decree was nearly complete. Then, a sudden groan of iron shattered the quiet sanctity of the hall. At the far end of the citadel, the massive double doors were shoved open, slamming against the stone walls with a force that sent a shudder through the floorboards. A bitter draught of winter wind rushed inside, guttering the nearest candles. The scribes flinched, quills pausing in mid-stroke, blotting dark ink onto pristine parchment. Genevieve stepped across the threshold. The stepsister wore an emerald-green gown that seemed aggressively loud against the solemn tones of the fortress. Every movement was calculated for maximum visibility, a theatrical disruption designed to tear focus away from the dais. Behind her, scurrying like a shadow, was Silas. The scheming official looked completely out of place, his shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously toward the royal guards. He clutched a heavy leather satchel against his chest, his knuckles white with strain. But it was the sound of Genevieve's approach that truly weaponized the silence. The hard heels of her boots struck the polished marble floor in a sharp, aggressive rhythm. It was a deliberate march, an auditory assault mocking the measured breathing of the assembly. The nobility parted for her, murmuring in confused whispers. The younger woman kept her chin high, her gaze locked on the dais. She was not here to throw a childish tantrum. She intended to use the machinery of the court against itself. Nellie did not gasp or reach for her husband's arm. She sat perfectly still, observing her sibling with the detached calculation of an archivist studying a dangerous text. She noted the frantic sheen of sweat on Silas Garrow's forehead despite the freezing draft. She saw the way Genevieve's hands trembled very slightly at her sides, a microscopic crack in the confident facade. "Halt the reading!" Genevieve's voice rang out, echoing off the high stone arches. She came to a stop just beyond the witness circle, planting her feet with a defiant stance. The Chancellor adjusted his spectacles, his face tightening with bureaucratic outrage. "Lady Genevieve, you are disrupting a sovereign betrothal. This is a direct violation of protocol. I invoke the lien of prior claim." Genevieve shouted over him, utilizing the specific administrative jargon of the kingdom's oldest property laws. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and lethal. "By the statutes of territorial guardianship, you cannot seal this decree. Nellie Vance does not have the right to pledge herself, her father's lands, or his archives to the crown." The scribes completely stopped writing. The silence that followed was the suffocating, dangerous stillness of a system that had just been violently derailed. Silas stepped forward, reaching into his satchel, though his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his cargo. Genevieve pointed a gloved finger directly at the dais. "She is already bound," the stepsister declared, her voice laced with venomous certainty. "And I have the documentation to prove it." Genevieve Vance stepped past the heavy iron doors, her heels striking the polished marble with aggressive precision. She ignored the territorial witnesses gathered along the peripheral benches, moving with absolute certainty. Clutched in her hands was a thick, poorly bound book. Reaching the edge of the royal dais, she refused to curtsy. Instead, she lifted the volume and slammed it down onto the ancient oak surface. The heavy thud of the forged ledger echoed into the vaulted ceiling, severing the rhythm of the betrothal ceremony. The impact sent a small tremor through the wood, rattling a silver goblet near Alistair Sterling's hand. Nellie Vance looked at the object. The leather cover was peeling at the corners, sealed with crude double-stitching that smelled strongly of damp cellar rot and cheap animal glue. Genevieve leveled her chin, projecting her voice so every seated elder could hear her accusation. She declared the royal betrothal void under the statutes of prior claim. She claimed that Edwin Vance had incurred catastrophic gambling debts to a western border lord. To prevent the liquidation of the estate, their father had allegedly signed away Nellie's guardianship, along with the deeds to the historical library. The ledger, Genevieve insisted, contained the notarized agreement granting the border lord authority over Nellie's future. By taking her as his mate, the Alpha King was committing a direct violation of a sovereign financial lien. Standing before the dais, the stepsister braced her shoulders into a rigid, triumphant posture. She angled her sharp features to catch the amber candlelight, fixing her stare directly on Nellie. She was waiting for the inevitable collapse. The court expected the overlooked daughter to finally shatter, to drop to her knees in her stiff-collared gown and plead with the sovereign for mercy. Genevieve's chest rose and fell with a sharp, eager rhythm, hungering for the sight of her sibling, breaking under the weight of public humiliation. Nellie did not move. She sat perfectly still in the high-backed wooden chair, her spine aligned straight against the hard grain. Her hands remained resting loosely over the folds of her lap. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The betrayer had finally chosen her moment, utilizing the most destructive public arena available to execute a calculated ruin. Yet Nellie offered no physical reaction. She did not gasp or shrink back into the shadows. Her breath remained slow and steady, drawing the scent of melting beeswax and cold stone deep into her lungs. The rigid silver collar of her dress pressed tight against her throat, acting as a structural brace that kept her chin elevated. She simply lowered her gaze to the peeling leather of the book resting on the table. She offered no frantic explanation to the man sitting beside her. The stillness stretched outward, swallowing the theatrical energy Genevieve had dragged into the hall. The initial shock in the hall fractured into a wave of intense, overlapping whispers. The sound swept across the gathered witnesses like dry leaves scraping over winter ice. Lords leaned toward their neighbors, their voices hushed but carrying the sharp edge of scandal. Elders exchanged calculating glances, mentally reassessing the political value of a bride burdened by insurmountable debt. The pressure in the room mounted, demanding a response. They wanted a fight. Nellie held her ground. She kept her silence as a deliberate, impenetrable shield against the escalating provocation. To speak now, to raise her voice in frantic contradiction, would be to step into the exact trap Genevieve had carefully laid. Arguing would reduce the royal betrothal to a messy dispute over a dead man's failures. Instead, the Archivist's daughter focused her attention away from the glaring eyes of the court, analyzing the concrete reality of the threat. Her gaze locked onto Genevieve's hands, which were still resting near the edge of the dais. The ambient candlelight caught the details the rest of the room ignored. There were distinct, dark smudges deeply embedded in the skin of the right index and middle fingers. Ink stains. Nellie's mind, trained by years of solitary labor in the deep records, began categorizing the evidence. The discoloration was not the faded, dusty brown of ancient archive ink, the kind Edwin had always used. It was a stark, bluish-black residue. It was fresh, caustic iron gall, a cheap modern compound that bit harshly into the epidermis and refused to wash away easily. Nellie calculated the timeline of the deception with clinical precision. Her father had been dead for over a year. The leather of the fraudulent ledger was artificially aged with moisture and dirt, but the ink. The physical proof was already sitting on the table, emitting the faint, sour odor of fresh chemical binding. Nellie kept her breathing shallow, preventing the stiff fabric of her bodice from rustling in the quiet air. She shifted her eyes fractionally to the side, observing the Alpha King without turning her head. Alistair sat with a terrifyingly calm demeanor, his broad shoulders relaxed against his chair. He was not looking at Genevieve's face. He was looking at the ledger, his gaze tracing the identical flaws Nellie had just categorized. The frantic whispers of the court, meant nothing against the cold, undeniable weight of administrative reality. Nellie allowed the silence to hold, trusting the machinery of the law over the chaos of the lie. Alistair Sterling did not immediately reach for the document. He let the object sit there for another long moment, a physical intrusion on the polished marble step, allowing the sheer audacity of the interruption to hang in the cold air. Genevieve stood with her chin raised, her posture radiating a manufactured triumph. She waited for the outrage. She waited for the Alpha King to rise, to demand explanations, to roar at the insult laid before his court. Instead, the sovereign leaned forward with measured deliberation. His movements were entirely unhurried, stripped of any predatory aggression that usually defined a challenged monarch. He picked up the forged ledger, its crude brass clasp clattering faintly against his signet ring. Alistair did not look at the woman who had presented it. He simply opened the cover. The dry crackle of the binding filled the massive hall, sharp and distinct beneath the vaulted ceiling. He ran a long, calloused thumb down the edge of the parchment, testing the weight of the fibre. His eyes tracked the margins of the ink, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying neutrality. To the assembled court, it was a disorienting spectacle. The King of the Northern Territories was examining a claim of catastrophic debt with the clinical detachment of a board accountant, auditing a provincial tax return. Genevieve shifted her weight, the rustle of her silk skirt loud in the tense silence. "The signature is clear," she announced, her voice slightly too sharp. Desperate to fill the void, Alistair refused to occupy. The debts were incurred over 4 years ago. The law of prior claim requires. Alistair raised a single hand, that the gesture was minimal, moving no more than 3 inches from the heavy oak armrest, but the entire hall immediately stopped breathing. The stepsister's words choked off in her throat. He lifted the open book closer to his face. The king closed his eyes and inhaled deeply along the spine, letting the scent of the adhesive and the aged parchment settle into his highly trained senses. He smelled damp earth, cheap tallow, and the sharp chemical tang of modern binding glue, a scent entirely contradictory to the alleged 4-year age of the record. He did not growl. He did not snarl. He simply set the forged ledger flat on his lap, smoothing a crease in this page with meticulous care. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as cold iron. The smirk on Genevieve's lips began to curdle at the edges. She had prepared herself for a violent rejection, a screaming match of denials, a chaotic scramble to preserve the engagement. She had not prepared for a man who treated her weapon as a mildly interesting piece of administrative clutter. Alistair continued to trace the ink lines, noting the hesitation in the pen strokes, the slight pooling of pigment where a hand had paused to mimic Edwin's confident scrawl. The ledger was not a bomb to him. It was a puzzle already solved. Silas Garrows stood 3 paces behind Genevieve, trying very hard to look like a man of unshakable authority. He wore a high-collared wool coat that had seen better days, the fabric frayed at the cuffs. When Alistair finally lifted his gaze from the book, he did not look at the stepsister. His dark eyes locked directly onto the rogue land bursar. The shift in focus was as physical as a sudden drop in temperature. "Master Garrow, I presume," the king said. His voice was a low, resonant murmur that carried effortlessly to the farthest corners of the massive fortress. It held no anger, only a terrifyingly soft inquiry. "Yes, your grace," Silas answered, his vocal cords tightening. He adjusted his collar, a nervous, jerky movement. A single bead of sweat broke out along his hairline, sliding down to smear a thin line of dirt against his neck. According to this rather fascinating document, Alistair continued, tapping the open page with one finger, Edwin Vance registered these debts in the southern borderlands. It lists the 14th day of the harvest month. "That is correct," Silas said, stepping forward slightly, trying to borrow some of the bravado Genevieve was rapidly losing. The transaction was properly witnessed and filed under the provincial code. "The provincial code," the sovereign repeated, testing the phrase as if turning a dull coin in his hand. A robust system. Tell me, Master Garrow, on the 14th day of the harvest month, 4 years ago, did you file this with the primary clerk in Oakhaven, or the secondary magistrate in the lower valley? Silas blinked, his eyes darting toward Genevieve for a fraction of a second before snapping back to the monarch. The primary clerk, Your Grace. It was a matter of significant value. Alistair leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, interlacing his fingers over the open ledger. Fascinating. The primary clerk in Oakhaven died of winter fever on the 10th day of that month. Silas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sweat on his neck was now a steady trickling, soaking into the cheap wool of his coat. He wiped his palms against his trousers, the abrasive sound echoing in the stillness. Genevieve shot him a white-hot glare, willing him to salvage the lie, but the bursar was already crumbling. The king had not drawn a weapon, had not raised his voice, and had not invoked a single ounce of predatory dominance. He was simply dismantling a man's life, with a working knowledge of regional tax schedules and the exact filing dates of obscure county officials. Having extracted the necessary contradictions, Alistair placed the mildewed leather book onto the polished oak of the royal days. He aligned the spine perfectly parallel to the edge of the wood, his movements possessing the unhurried, clinical precision of a surgeon preparing a sterile table. The dull thud of the false ledger hitting the timber briefly drowned out the frantic murmurs of the gathered nobility. He turned his head just a fraction, his cool gaze finding the highest legal officer in the room. Robert Mercer stood stationed at the base of the dais, his hands folded deeply within the heavy, dark velvet sleeves of his ceremonial robes. The older man wore a face built for absolute neutrality, shaped and hardened by decades of adjudicating territorial grievances and unpicking complex inheritance laws. He watched the sovereign with the unwavering attention of a veteran sailor reading a shift in the wind. His voice was a low, steady current, lacking any trace of the theatrical outrage the stepsister had clearly hoped to provoke. Send your most trusted wardens to the western wing. Have them descend into the deep earth vaults beneath the tower. Robert blinked, a slow, highly deliberate motion. The residual whispers in the great hall died instantly. You will bypass the standard civilian registries, the king continued, his words carrying effortlessly through the freezing northern air to the furthest corners of the gallery. You will command the keepers to unlock the iron grates of the Foundation archives. Bring me the great cartulary of the Northern Territories. The command settled over the grand room like a sudden, severe drop in barometric pressure. The air itself seemed to thin. The great cartulary was not merely a book of records. It was the absolute, unalterable anchor of all sovereign law within the kingdom, a massive, ancient register containing the original blood treaty cartularies and undisputed land grants of every noble house. To summon it from the darkness was to initiate an audit of the highest possible consequence, a legal mechanism historically reserved only for the permanent dissolution of territories or the execution of high treason. For a fraction of a second, Robert hesitated. It was not a display of insubordination, but rather the sheer, involuntary physical shock of a man realizing the immense gravity of the impending judgment. The Chancellor's rigid posture locked tight. He understood exactly what the sovereign was about to do to the woman standing in the center of the aisle. Recovering his composure, the veteran bureaucrat lowered his head in a deep, measured bow. The heavy fabric of his robes swept softly against the cold stone floor. At once, Your Majesty, the man answered, his tone reflecting the solemn weight of the order. The Chancellor turned on his heel, gesturing sharply to 4 armed royal guards stationed at the perimeter pillars. They fell in step behind him, marching out of the hall in perfect unison. The heavy oak doors groaned as they were pulled open, then shut behind the departing detail with a definitive clang, sealing the court in a breathless, suspended quiet. The waiting began. Inside the sprawling architecture of the Obsidian Citadel, time was measured not by the ticking of clockwork, but by the slow, uneven burn of beeswax and the creeping chill of the northern stone. Nellie remained completely still in her seat. She kept her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting gently over the awkward, stiff-collared fabric of her borrowed silver dress. She did not look at her furious relative, nor did she seek reassurance from the man seated beside her. She simply let the silence settle into her chest like cold water into stone. As the daughter of the late royal archivist, she knew the exact geography of the subterranean library. She calculated the journey in her mind, marking the minutes as they passed. 7 minutes for the guards to descend the winding limestone stairs into the freezing dark. 3 minutes for the keeper to verify the Chancellor's seal and work the heavy iron keys into the rusted vault locks. Another 5 minutes to carefully lift the massive object from its protective pedestal, and 10 minutes to carry its immense weight back up to the surface. 25 minutes of absolute unbroken silence. Alistair occupied that silence without a single twitch of discomfort. The king sat comfortably in the crushing quiet, his breathing slow, and even his attention fixed calmly on the flickering flame of a nearby candle. Across the wide aisle, Genevieve was slowly learning that silence was infinitely heavier and far more dangerous than noise. The vindictive woman had prepared herself for a screaming match. She had dressed for a dramatic confrontation, expecting tears, desperate denials, and a chaotic emotional breakdown that would publicly prove her quiet sister's unsuitability for the crown. She had not prepared to be trapped in a freezing, perfectly still administrative waiting room. At first, the intruder tried to maintain her triumphant smirk. She stood with her chin tilted high, casting a defiant, sharp shadow against the marble pillars, but as the minutes stretched endlessly outward, 5, then 10, then 15. The damp cold of the hall began to seep through her thin, fashionable southern fabrics. Her jaw visibly tightened. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the sharp click of her heel betraying a rising tide of impatience. Beside her, Silas shifted nervously, the corrupt auditor sweating despite the frigid drafts cutting through the hall. Nellie watched her stepsister with the quiet, detached observation of a scholar studying a failing structural beam. Genevieve's fingers, adorned with cheap, flashy rings, began to twitch against the heavy silk of her skirts. The repetitive, nervous plucking of the fabric was a microscopic detail, but to anyone paying attention, it screamed of a sudden, dawning terror. The smirk finally melted from the woman's face, replaced by the sickening realization that her fabricated paper was about to be physically compared to the oldest, most merciless truth in the kingdom. The great cartulary of the Northern Territories required 2 grown men to lift. It was bound in blackened iron and ancient, hardened leather, thick as a fortress wall and heavily reinforced with brass cornerings. They carried it slowly down the central aisle, the sheer mass of the book drawing the wide, fearful eyes of every noble in the gallery. The guards reached the royal dais, and he heaved the massive register onto the center of the long table. The impact produced a deep, hollow boom that vibrated through the thick floorboards and resonated in the chest of everyone present. A faint, ghostly cloud of subterranean dust bloomed upward into the amber candlelight, filling the immediate air with the dry, undeniable scent of deep earth, old pine resin, and centuries of undisturbed authority. Silence descended over the grand hall as the dust settled. It was not the expectant hush of a crowd waiting for violence, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a court recognizing the ultimate authority of the archives. The ambient warmth of hundreds of beeswax candles did nothing to soften the cold gravity radiating from the ancient book. A freezing northern draught swept down from the high windows of the grand keep, carrying the faint scent of pine oil, but no one in the assembly dared to shiver. Alistair stepped toward the register. He did not look at Genevieve. He did not acknowledge the rogue land bursar, trembling near the limestone pillars. His attention belonged entirely to the artifact. Nellie watched his steady hands hover over the cover, noting the distinct absence of tension in his shoulders. His movements were unhurried, devoid of the aggressive posturing typical of pack leaders who relied on intimidation. He occupied the space around the dais the way a senior Archivist approached a sacred relic, treating the physical record of the territory with terrifying reverence. At the center of the heavy iron-clasped cover rested the sapphire wax seal. It was a pristine pool of deep blue wax, stamped with the intricate crest of the crown's central registry. The vibrant color was startling against the time-worn leather, unblemished and perfectly smooth. Nellie felt her breath catch. She recognized that specific seal. Her father had spent his life in drafty libraries, teaching her the difference between true authority and mere brute force. True authority left an unbroken paper trail. It could survive centuries locked in cold earth without diminishing in power. Alistair rested his thumb against the outer edge of the blue wax. He did not raise his voice to address the whispering assembly. He simply applied calculated pressure. The crisp, sharp snap of the breaking sapphire wax echoed under the vaulted ceiling. Flakes of brilliant blue fell away, scattering across the dark oak like shattered glass. It was a remarkably small auditory beat, yet in the absolute quiet of the hall, it carried the concussive force of a falling blade. The fracturing of that seal was the literal breaking of Genevieve's false narrative, cleanly severing the lie from the air. Nellie let the sound settle into her rigid spine. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why, but the undeniable, mathematical geometry of that broken wax brought a different kind of pressure to her throat. The king had not raised a single claw to defend her. He had simply opened the truth. The heavy cover of the register groaned in protest as Alistair folded it back upon its brass hinges. Instantly, the scent of dry paper, iron gall ink, and cold dust spilled into the atmosphere, overriding the heavy perfumes worn by the gathered nobility. With meticulous care, the sovereign turned the oversized vellum leaves. His knuckles whitened slightly as he navigated the dense historical geography of the northern borderlands. He stopped at a heavily annotated folio. The parchment here was thick, yellowed at the edges, and covered in cramped handwriting. This was the true, unalterable registry of Edwin Vance's estate, recorded long before the current generation learned how to forge a signature. Without shifting his dominant posture, Alistair reached out and picked up the forged ledger. Beside the weathered weight of the true archive, Genevieve's mildewed leather book looked flimsy. It was a shallow imitation designed to intimidate a vulnerable woman, never meant to withstand the unforgiving scrutiny of a sovereign king. Alistair lifted a single, loose leaf from the center of the fake ledger. He did not bother to read the fraudulent signature. Instead, he stepped away from the table and held the parchment directly in front of the nearest tall beeswax candle. The amber flame illuminated the page from behind, turning the opaque paper into a glowing, translucent screen of fiber. The foundational law of prior claim, Alistair spoke, his voice a low, measured drawl that carried effortlessly to the furthest shadows of the room, requires that a binding debt be recorded in the exact year it was supposedly incurred. Your ledger claims my betrothed's father signed this contract 12 years ago. Genevieve stood perfectly still, though the elaborate, theatrical confidence she had worn into the hall was visibly fracturing. Her chin remained rigidly lifted, but her eyes darted nervously toward the illuminated paper. The silk of her gown rustled as she shifted her weight, a tiny sound betraying her rising panic. However, Alistair continued, his tone devoid of anger, entirely clinical. The watermark pressed deep into the fibers of this specific page bears the insignia of a southern marshland paper mill. He rotated his wrist a fraction of an inch, allowing the flickering candlelight to throw the faint, ghostly outline of a crested heron into sharp relief within the paper. Nellie recognized the manufacturer's mark instantly from her years in the archives. It was a distinctly modern watermark, completely foreign to the cold northern territories. That specific mill, the king stated, lowering the paper and setting it flat onto the oak surface, was only constructed and licensed 3 years ago, 9 full years after Edwin Vance supposedly signed this leaf. He did not shout her down. He did not bare his teeth to assert physical dominance. The Alpha King simply utilized indisputable historical paper manufacturing facts to systematically dismantle the forgery in front of the witness circle. Genevieve's face drained of all color, her lips parting as the mathematical impossibility of her own lie trapped her completely. The dry, administrative detail had become a weapon of absolute truth, infinitely sharper than any physical blade. Nellie watched in unbroken silence as the arrogant architecture of her stepsister's deception collapsed into dust. Alistair did not close the books. The massive, iron-bound register sat open on his left, its ancient pages breathing a dry, dusty scent of centuries into the grand hall. To his right lay the disputed document, its leather cover already looking small and inconsequential under the amber candlelight. The Alpha King did not raise his voice to demand a confession from the intruders. He simply extended 2 fingers toward the High Chancellor's assistant, requesting a very specific item from the Citadel's or apothecary supplies. A servant hurried forward, placing a small, clear glass vial on the polished oak table. Nellie recognized the sharp, astringent smell even before the cork stopper was completely removed. It was distilled white vinegar. She understood the chemical mechanics of archival preservation better than anyone in the room. Having spent her life surrounded by aging parchment, she felt a quiet, steady hum of anticipation settle in her chest, realizing exactly how her husband intended to execute this particular judgment. Alistair looked down at the false signature. He explained the properties of historical ink to the silent assembly, his low tone matching that of a university lecturer, detailing an elegant mathematical proof. He stated that Edwin Vance had been a strict traditionalist. Her father had always brewed his own ink from crushed oak galls, ferrous sulfate, and strained rainwater. That specific acidic mixture did not merely sit on top of the parchment. It bit deep into the natural fibers, oxidizing over time to a dark, rusted brown that became structurally permanent and immune to common solvents. The sovereign picked up the forged ledger. He tilted the open page toward the ambient light, pointing out the suspicious, reflective sheen of the black pigment. He noted that such ink required modern chemical drying agents to cure quickly without smudging, a cheap formula heavily favored by regional clerks who lacked the patience for proper, time-consuming historical binding. Silence hung heavy over the Obsidian Citadel. Alistair dipped the pointed tip of a silver stylus into the vial of vinegar. He brought the metal instrument down to the very edge of the fabricated signature, allowing a single precise drop of acidic liquid to fall onto the thick black line. The reaction was instantaneous. True iron gall ink would have remained entirely unaffected, bonded forever to the underlying paper. Instead, the modern binder in the fake document dissolved on contact. The stark black pigment bloomed outward, smearing across the parchment in a muddy, bluish streak that ruined the bottom half of the page. The king did not say a single word. He simply turned the smeared, bleeding signature outward, presenting the undeniable physical evidence of fraud to the rogue land bursar. Silas stared at the spreading ink stain as if it were a fatal physical wound. The absolute certainty of the chemical reaction dismantled his confidence in a matter of seconds. The oppressive, waiting quiet of the royal court pressed down on his shoulders, making the sound of his own shallow breathing seem entirely too loud. The man had expected a shouting match, a chaotic debate over legal precedent, or perhaps a contest of spoken promises. He had absolutely not prepared to argue against the immutable laws of chemistry. He attempted to salvage the situation, his voice cracking awkwardly under the intense, unblinking scrutiny of the room. The bursar stammered out a series of frantic, deeply contradictory explanations. He suggested that the original contract had been severely damaged in a southern flood, requiring a junior clerk to recopy the terms for the sake of clarity. He claimed the updated, shiny ink was merely a bureaucratic necessity, a standard and accepted practice in the marshland territories. None of his desperate excuses carried any weight against the cold, analytical stare of the sovereign seated before him. Genevieve recognized the rapid, catastrophic collapse of their strategy. Her jaw tightened, the muscles ticking visibly beneath her pale, powdered skin. She leaned slightly toward her co-conspirator, whispering a harsh, breathless command for him to close his mouth and maintain his dignity. She desperately needed him to stand firm, to rely on the legal ambiguity of the outer territories and ride out the scrutiny. Unfortunately for her, she had fundamentally misjudged his psychological endurance. The bursar was a man accustomed to bullying desperate, impoverished debtors, not facing a monarch who dismantled high treason with a single drop of vinegar. The terrifying reality of sovereign punishment finally pierced through his arrogant greed. Silas took a sudden, erratic step backward, driven by a blind, primal instinct to escape. Genevieve tried to step back with him, but the fabric was pinned tight against the cold marble floor. The heavy silk tore with a sharp, violent ripping sound that echoed harshly off the vaulted stone ceiling. The sudden, unexpected loss of physical balance shattered her carefully constructed, aristocratic posture in an instant. She stumbled awkwardly forward, her arms flailing in a deeply undignified attempt to catch herself before she hit the ground. Silas did not try to catch her. He simply continued to back away, babbling a pathetic, disjointed stream of apologies to the throne. His trembling hand rose, pointing an accusatory finger directly at the woman, struggling to right herself beside him. The grand illusion of their unified legal authority vanished entirely, replaced by the clumsy, desperate panic of two exposed frauds turning on each other under pressure. Alistair Sterling watched their pathetic collapse with the sterile, exhausted patience of a clerk finding a mathematical error that must be permanently erased. He occupied the space without apology, entirely immune to their frantic excuses. Gesturing slightly with two fingers, he summoned an aide from the shadows behind the royal dais. The servant stepped forward, carrying a polished silver tray. Resting upon the metal was a neat stack of folded parchment, each piece sealed with a crumbling, cheap crimson wax that smelled faintly of copper and pine resin. Nellie watched her betrothed's unhurried movements, her breathing strictly measured, her spine perfectly aligned against the stiff fabric of her borrowed dress. She knew the texture of those specific letters. During her isolated months in the family manor, she had seen couriers slipping away from her stepmother's estate in the dead of night, carrying missives wrapped in oiled leather to protect them from the northern frost. Genevieve Vance recognized the red seals instantly. The blood drained from her face, leaving her painted cheeks looking stark and artificial under the amber light. She took a half step backward, her heels scraping sharply against the polished marble floor. The southern trade routes have always required careful observation, the Alpha King stated. His tone remained entirely conversational, yet the ancient acoustics carried every syllable to the furthest stone pillars. When a rogue land bursar attempts to circumvent the Crown's jurisdiction, my border scouts take a distinct interest in his correspondence. Alistair picked up the topmost letter, breaking the brittle red wax with a sharp, echoing snap. You claimed this intervention was a matter of old gambling debts, the sovereign continued, his gaze drifting down the inked lines. And yet, this particular correspondence, dated precisely 14 days ago, details a coordinated effort to seize the royal archives under the guise of an inherited lien. Silas Garrow opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically, but no sound emerged. The imposing architecture of the citadel seemed to press down on him, physically shrinking his posture. The king smoothed the paper flat against the oak table. There is a specific passage here that clarifies the intent behind this clumsy fabrication. He read the words with the flat, clinical precision of an auditor reviewing a routine grain shipment. "The quiet mouse will not fight back," Alistair read aloud, the words dropping like cold stones into the vast space. She has spent her entire life hiding among her dead father's mouldering books. Present the ledger loudly enough, and she will simply bow her head and accept her replacement. The archives will be ours before the first snow falls. In the echoing expanse of the hall, the cruel, theatrical words sounded utterly pathetic. The venom the stepsister had poured into her ink lost all its dramatic weight, reduced to the petty scribbling of an envious conspirator. Nellie felt the collective gaze of the assembly shift. The nobles were not looking at the quiet archivist's daughter with pity. They were looking at Genevieve with a profound disgust. The malice that had terrorized Nellie's youth was laid bare, exposed not by a screaming match, but by the devastating neutrality of a sovereign who dealt only in undeniable proof. The sovereign lowered the parchment, setting it beside the shattered pieces of crimson wax. He offered no further commentary. The evidence was absolute, and he did not insult the intelligence of his court by explaining a mathematical certainty. He simply turned his head toward the austere figure, waiting patiently at the edge of the dais. High Chancellor Robert Mercer stepped forward, his heavy woolen robes sweeping the stone tiles without a sound. In his hands he carried no weapons, only the thick, leather-bound volume of the Crown's penal registry, and a long, heavy iron stylus. The Chancellor's face was a mask of strict neutrality. He opened the ledger, the thick vellum pages turning with a deliberate rhythm. A faint smell of old dust and cold iron drifted outward from the ancient binding. "Silas of the Garrow estate," Robert began, his voice a dry, resonant baritone that offered no room for pleading. "By the authority vested in this royal court, you are hereby charged with the highest offences against the Crown's structural integrity." The rogue land bursar collapsed forward, attempting to retreat toward the iron doors, but two armoured guards had already moved to block the central aisle. Their halberds rested in a crossed position, an impassable barrier of cold steel. "You stand officially accused of document fabrication, the unauthorized manipulation of regional seals, and conspiracy to commit systemic fraud against a royal betrothal," the Chancellor continued, reading directly from the unyielding text of the kingdom's oldest laws. "These acts constitute administrative treason, punishable by immediate and permanent erasure." Genevieve's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. She looked toward the unmoving faces of the noble witnesses, desperately searching for a sympathetic audience. But there was no stage left for her to play upon. The court operated entirely on the mechanics of paper, ink, and sworn testimony, and she had brought a poorly constructed lie into the very heart of the truth. Robert did not pause to allow Silas to mount a defense. The Chancellor lifted the heavy iron stylus, gripping the cold metal firmly in his right hand. He leaned over the penal registry, aligning the sharp point with the active ledgers of the realm. "By decree of the sovereign, your legal standing as a bursar of this territory is permanently revoked." He pressed the iron tip into the parchment, where the man's name had been officially recorded. The sound that followed was jarring, a loud, abrasive scrape of metal, tearing brutally through the top layer of thick vellum. It was a violent, final noise that cut through the absolute silence of the hall like a physical blow. The stylus crossed out the letters of Silas's name with a heavy, black line of administrative erasure. Nellie kept her hands folded softly in her lap, watching the precise movement of the Chancellor's wrist. The scratch of the iron stylus was the unmistakable sound of a structural deletion. The man who had threatened to drag her away to the freezing borderlands was losing his legal existence in real time. He could no longer trade, sign contracts, travel on royal roads, or hold land within the kingdom's borders. He was being systematically unmade by the very administrative system he had tried to weaponize. The Chancellor lifted the stylus, brushing a tiny, curled shaving of ruined parchment from the page. He closed the thick volume with a dull, resonant thud. The legal machinery of the court had consumed the threat entirely, leaving nothing in its wake but the cold consequence of a recorded judgment. Alistair Sterling did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room built of black basalt and polished oak, the sovereign's tone carried the absolute weight of a falling guillotine. He stood behind the heavy wooden dais, his posture perfectly aligned, his large hands resting lightly on the brass edges of the reading stand. The king looked down at the two figures kneeling on the cold stone floor, not with superiority, but with the sterile, exhausted patience of a clerk finding a mathematical error that must be permanently erased. By the statutes governing the sovereign borders, the fabrication of a blood treaty constitutes a direct assault on the crown itself, Alistair stated, each syllable clipping through the heavy, wax-scented air. He did not pace. His stillness was absolute. You have attempted to overwrite the recorded truth of this court with cheap southern parchment and fraudulent ink in the forged ledger. You sought to use the law as a weapon to claim a daughter of this house. The law therefore demands a severe correction. Silas Garrow was already trembling. He pressed his forehead against the freezing stone. He offered no verbal defense, knowing that the physical evidence arrayed on the table above him had systematically dismantled his entire operation. The undeniable proof of the mismatched watermarks had severed his connections to the wealthy southern lords forever. Genevieve Vance, however, remained rigidly upright. Her chest heaved, the fine silk of her borrowed gown pulling tight across her ribs as she glared up at the royal dais. She opened her mouth, inhaling sharply to launch another shrill, theatrical denial. But the king did not pause to allow her performance to begin. For the crime of administrative treason, I decree the immediate forfeiture of all personal properties, titles, and holdings registered to Silas Garrow, the sovereign continued, his gaze drifting from the shaking man to the rigid woman beside him. And for Genevieve Vance, who orchestrated this fraud against her own bloodline to satisfy a hollow ambition, the sentence is permanent banishment. You are hereby stripped of your family name, your rank, and your privileges. You are remanded to the northern salt flats. A collective gasp swept through the assembled nobility. The salt flats were a desolate, frozen expanse located at the very edge of the sovereign territories. It was a barren wasteland entirely devoid of the high society and borrowed status the stepsister had spent her entire life trying to hoard. It was an absolute quiet void. You cannot do this to me. Genevieve shrieked, the facade of aristocratic poise shattering. She lunged forward, hooking her fingers into claws, as if she could tear the decree from the air. I am the rightful heir. I belong in this court. You cannot throw me out like a common thief. Her final objection never materialized. Alistair gave a single abbreviated nod to the captain of the Royal Guard. Instantly, a wall of armored sentries stepped forward in terrifying unison. The synchronized, rhythmic clash of iron-shod boots striking the basalt floor swallowed her voice entirely. It was a mechanical, procedural sound, an inevitable force of the law executing its unyielding mandate. The sheer concussive volume of the marching formation erased her loud performance beneath the crushing machinery of the sovereign's justice. The sentries clamped heavy leather gauntlets onto the arms of the conspirators. Silas offered zero physical resistance, his legs dragging uselessly beneath him like wet linen as two massive soldiers hauled him backward. Genevieve fought them with everything she had. She kicked, twisted, and thrashed against the unyielding iron grips, her elaborate hairstyle coming undone to hang in wild, tangled ribbons across her face. They dragged her backward toward the massive iron doors of the great court. Her expensive heels scraped against the polished marble, leaving faint, erratic scuff marks. Her Protests echoed sharply against the high vaulted ceilings, bouncing off the ancient stone pillars. The sound grew distorted as she was hauled down the empty corridors, transforming into a shrill noise that slowly faded into the freezing northern night. Through it all, Nellie Vance did not move an inch. She remained seated in her high-backed mahogany chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap over the folds of her skirt. She did not flinch when the heavy iron doors groaned shut, sealing the grand hall once more and cutting off the last faint echo of the commotion. She shed no tears for the sibling who had just lost everything in a gamble for unearned power. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. Nellie simply watched the empty space on the stone floor, where her step-sibling had been kneeling only moments before. She let the reality of the permanent departure settle into her chest, like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The court around her was perfectly still. The hundreds of nobles who had been whispering in hushed anticipation only an hour ago now sat in breathless silence. They were watching the quiet, overlooked daughter of Edwin Vance, who had just survived a lethal political assassination without raising a single finger, shedding a single tear, or speaking a single defensive word. Nellie slowly reached up to the stiff silver collar of her awkward dress. She adjusted the heavy fabric against her delicate collarbone. For the first time since she had put the garment on, it felt remarkably lighter. She lowered her hands back to her lap, the cracked skin of her knuckles resting against the smooth silk, and shifted her gaze toward the sovereign. Alistair was already reorganizing the scattered documents on his reading stand. He tapped the edges of the great cartulary against the wood to align its massive pages perfectly, his large hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a scholar. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had successfully concluded a routine, necessary audit, restoring the logical order of a disorganized room. The air in the citadel, once thick with the scent of impending betrayal, now felt clean, crisp, and profoundly safe. As the heavy iron doors of the Obsidian Citadel closed with a resonating thud, swallowing the last frantic shrieks of Genevieve Vance, silence reclaimed the grand hall. It was not the suffocating quiet of a crowd waiting for execution, but the clean, stabilized stillness of a room purged of a profound falsehood. Alistair Sterling remained beside the royal dais, his posture completely unaffected by the preceding chaos. He did not rush toward Nellie to offer a dramatic embrace, nor did he speak words of sweeping comfort. Instead, his focus remained on the unyielding machinery of administrative law. High Chancellor Robert Mercer finished his notes on a pristine sheet of heavy vellum. "It shall be recorded exactly as you dictate, my king. The structural correction will be locked in the permanent archives before dawn." Alistair traced a gloved finger along the authentic watermark of the ancient register, ensuring its historical continuity remained unblemished. He looked up, his pale gaze finding Nellie in the center of the vast floor. "Furthermore," Alistair continued, his tone shifting from punitive command to undeniable restoration, "let the royal decree reflect that the bride is not merely transferring her residence. Let it be written in the primary charter that Nellie is hereby recognized as the sole undisputed legal guardian of Edwin Vance's historical collection. The deep earth vaults and all associated records belonging to her late father are permanently restored to her exclusive, sovereign jurisdiction." The decree settled over the room like a heavy, protective cloak. It was a victory measured not in spilled blood, but in the quiet restoration of intellectual autonomy. Alistair stepped down from the dais, his dark velvet mantle sweeping over the stone. He stopped exactly at the boundary of her personal space, preserving the careful distance that defined his respect for her autonomy. Reaching beneath his cloak, the sovereign withdrew a forged iron ring. Suspended from the loop were 3 massive keys, the original instruments of access to the most guarded levels of the royal archive vaults. He extended his hand. The keys clinked softly, a hollow metallic sound cutting through the scent of melting beeswax. Nellie reached out, her breath catching faintly as she accepted the offering. As the heavy iron passed from his palm to hers, the metal was initially frigid, tasting of subterranean cold and old rust. But as her cracked knuckles curled around the jagged teeth, her fingers brushed the edge of his. The cold iron rested heavily in her palm, slowly absorbing the residual heat of Alistair's hand, warming against her skin in a tactile promise of shared preservation and earned trust. Alistair took a measured step back, allowing her the physical space to process the weight of the iron ring. He offered a brief nod to Robert, signalling that the tribunal portion of the evening had officially reached its end. The High Chancellor tapped his wooden staff twice against the marble floor, a sharp crack that formally dismissed the sovereign court. The gathered nobility, who had stood paralyzed by the king's meticulous deconstruction of the fraud, finally began to move. Their departure was an exercise in calculated caution. The elites of the Northern Territories did not stare openly at Nellie anymore. The underlying geometry of the room had fundamentally shifted. They looked at her now with a wary, undeniable respect, recognizing that the quiet woman in the awkward silver gown was a recognized scholar fully protected by the highest legal authority. The acoustic landscape filled with the rustle of heavy silk skirts, the thud of polished boots on stone, and the low murmurs of retreating lords. One by one, the massive side doors swallowed the aristocratic crowd into the freezing night, until only the royal guards and the dying embers in the great hearths remained. Nellie stood alone near the base of the empty royal dais. She did not immediately turn to follow the retreating nobles, nor did she seek out the immediate company of the king, who had quietly stepped aside to confer with his head archivist in the shadowed alcoves. Instead, she remained perfectly still, allowing the profound, unbroken silence of the Obsidian Citadel to settle completely over her shoulders. She listened to the subtle sounds of the ancient fortress breathing around her, the crackle of a collapsing pine log in the fireplace, the faint draught of the northern wind rattling the leaded glass windows, and the steady ticking of the astronomical clock in the corridor. Hundreds of beeswax candles had burned down to uneven stubs. In their wavering amber light, Nellie watched thousands of tiny dust motes drift lazily through the cold air, suspended in a state of absolute, undisturbed peace. The grand hall smelled deeply of extinguished linen wicks, dry parchment, and the clean ozone of the freezing night air. The threat had not been defeated by a chaotic physical confrontation or a desperate plea for mercy. It had been dismantled systematically by paper, watermarks, and the sovereign enforcement of unalterable truth. Her fingers tightened around the archive keys, the warmed iron biting pleasantly into the sensitive skin of her palm. Standing in the quiet aftermath, she felt the definitive transition from a state of cold public vulnerability to a deep, impenetrable intellectual security. She was finally safe, not because a powerful beast had claimed her as his vulnerable property, but because a meticulous king had recognized her competence and legally fortified her right to exist on her own terms. Once the northern nobility departed and the court was formally dismissed, Nellie followed the king into the private library of the Obsidian Citadel. The heavy iron and oak door clicked shut behind them, severing the echoing murmurs of the great court. Inside, the air was immediately different. It lacked the draughty dampness of the hall, replaced instead by the dense, warm scent of aging vellum, dried rosemary used to ward off silverfish, and the faint, sharp tang of iron gall ink. Nellie Vance stood near the center of the expansive room, allowing the silence to settle over her shoulders. The stiff-collared silver dress she wore had served its purpose as armor under the scrutiny of the High Council. But now, in the quiet isolation of the archive, its rigid boning merely felt heavy. She simply remained on the woven wool rug, listening to the crackle of the hearth fire burning steadily against the far wall. Alistair Sterling crossed the room toward a low-side table near the window. He did not ask if she was shaken by the trial. He did not offer hollow platitudes about her stepsister's banishment or the betrayal of her bloodline. Instead, he struck a long wooden match and lit a small spirit lamp beneath a polished brass kettle. His movements remained unhurried, carrying the same clinical, terrifying precision he had just used to dismantle Genevieve Vance's forgery before the entire Royal Assembly. He waited for the water to heat, his tall frame cutting a dark silhouette against the amber glow of the lamps. The king occupied the quiet of the room without apology, entirely free from the nervous impulse to fill the space with unnecessary speech. When the kettle began to hum, he poured the steaming water over dark tea leaves, allowing the rich scent of bergamot to rise into the dry air. He picked up a porcelain cup by its delicate handle and walked back to where she stood. Alistair stopped a respectful distance away, extending the saucer. He did not brush her fingers as she took it. He maintained the precise physical boundary she had relied upon all evening. The heat of the ceramic seeped through her thin silk gloves, grounding her. She took a slow breath, letting the warmth radiate into her palms. Alistair leaned back against the edge of a massive mahogany reading desk, his gaze sweeping over the towering, shadow-draped shelves that lined the walls. "Is the lighting in here sufficient for your work?" he asked, his voice pitched low, entirely pragmatic. Nellie looked up, momentarily caught off guard by the mundane nature of the question. "The northern-facing windows tend to lose the sun by mid-afternoon," Alistair continued, his dark eyes analyzing the angle of the vaulted ceiling. "The current lamps burn a refined oil that produces no soot, preserving the bindings, but the cast is somewhat dim. If you require more focused illumination for the archiving of your father's records, I will have standing candelabras brought up from the lower vaults." She let the reality of his words sink into her chest. He was not probing for tears. He was not demanding a display of emotional fragility. He was anchoring her in the practical, the immediate, the intellectual. He was offering her infrastructure. "The lighting is adequate," Nellie answered, her voice steadying as she took a small sip of the tea. "I am accustomed to reading the finer scripts in the dark." "You will not have to read in the dark here," he replied simply. Their intimacy was not built on sudden physical proximity or overwhelming declarations. It was constructed from this shared recognition of order, the mutual respect for history, and the careful preservation of boundaries. He understood that safety for her was not an embrace. Safety was a well-lit room and the guarantee that her work would remain undisturbed. Alistair set his own untouched cup upon the desk and turned to a locked central drawer. He produced a small brass key from his waistcoat, turned the mechanism with a sharp click, and retrieved a flat, oilcloth-wrapped folio. He carried it to the center table, where the primary reading lamp pooled its brightest light over the polished wood. He folded back the protective cloth with the careful reverence of a seasoned scholar. Inside rested a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored parchment. It was the Freedom Charter. This was not a standard pact decree or a boilerplate territorial contract. It was a highly customized legal document, drafted with the exact meticulous care he had applied to the Great Cartulary. Nellie stepped closer to the table, her breath catching slightly as the lamplight illuminated the text. Alistair immediately stepped back, giving her unimpeded physical access to the parchment. He did not guide her hand, nor did he hover over her shoulder. She lowered her gaze to the heavy page. The charter outlined her absolute, uncontested autonomy. The clauses formally severed any remaining financial ties to her father's alleged debts, nullified her family's manipulative estate claims, and permanently barred any border baron from asserting a prior claim against her person. It established her not as a dependent ward of the crown, but as a sovereign individual with full custodial rights over the royal archives and her own inheritance. Nellie reached out, her fingertips hovering just millimeters above the thick, textured paper. She traced the air above the elegant calligraphy of her own name, written in a deep, iron-rich black ink that had already dried completely into the fibers. The physical reality of the parchment settled into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. For her entire life, her worth had been dictated by the spoken lies of her stepmother and the forged obligations of her stepsister. Now, her freedom was rendered in indisputable, unalterable text. Alistair watched her read, his posture perfectly still. "The High Council has already reviewed the foundational clauses," he stated, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "It requires only your signature to take permanent effect. Once executed, no member of your family, no corrupt bursar, and no future chancellor can contest your standing within these walls." She looked at the bottom corner of the page, where a pristine pool of blue wax waited beside the empty space reserved for her own mark. The romantic climax of their partnership did not require a dramatic confession or a desperate physical claim. It was written right here in the flawless margins and the precise, impenetrable legal protections he had spent hours drafting in secret. He was using his supreme sovereign power not to own her, but to ensure she could never be owned by anyone else. The library held the kind of profound stillness that only existed behind 3 feet of solid stone and heavy iron hinges. Here, entirely insulated from the vaulted corridors and the lingering whispers of the Obsidian Citadel, the air smelled of dry parchment, aged cedarwood, and the faint, sharp tang of iron gall ink. Nellie sat at the edge of the massive mahogany table, her spine perfectly straight against the carved wooden chair. Across from her sat Alistair. Between them rested the Freedom Charter. The document was a masterpiece of administrative architecture. Its heavy vellum pages lay completely uncreased under the warm amber glow of a brass reading lamp, the black ink of the clauses flowing in perfectly measured, unbroken lines. It did not speak of biological destiny or pack compulsion. Instead, the text outlined absolute sovereignty. It secured her late father's vast historical collections under her exclusive, permanent stewardship. It explicitly dismantled any future familial claims to her person, her labor, or her territorial estate. Every carefully drafted clause functioned as an impenetrable fortress built of syntax and statute, establishing a new reality that belonged entirely to her. The king did not rush the procedure. He reached toward a polished silver tray holding 2 identical steel-nibbed pens. His movements were characteristically unhurried, devoid of the aggressive, possessive posturing that so often defined the ruling elite. He picked up the first pen, dipped the nib into the shallow glass inkwell, and tapped the rim exactly once to clear the excess liquid. He reversed the instrument, offering the dry end to his new bride. He did not issue a command. He simply waited, his dark eyes watching the steady, controlled rise and fall of her breathing. Nellie reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the pen, testing its balance. She did not hesitate, nor did her knuckles turn white with unexpressed anxiety. Taking the instrument, she pulled the heavy parchment a single inch closer to her side of the table. She read the final line of the charter one last time, letting the absolute finality of the legal language settle into her mind like a cornerstone, finding its permanent placement in the cold earth. She pressed the steel nib to the paper. The only sound in the cavernous room was the sharp, rhythmic scratching of metal against vellum. She wrote her name with precise, deliberate loops. Every stroke was an erasure of Genevieve's loud, theatrical lies in the great hall. Every drop of ink laid a structural foundation that no border baron or corrupt bursar could ever dismantle. When she finished the signature, she set the pen down on the silver tray. Alistair took the second pen. He did not pull the document toward himself. Instead, he leaned across the wide expanse of mahogany. He aligned his nib directly beneath her fresh signature. His writing was sharp, highly vertical, and completely unhesitating. The scratching of his pen echoed hers, establishing a synchronized mechanical rhythm that carried significantly more weight than any shouted vow in a crowded ceremonial court. They were not exchanging generic promises of eternal, explosive passion. They were executing an unbreakable commitment of mutual respect, bound by the highest administrative authority in the Northern Territories. This was a partnership of hard evidence, constructed by a sovereign who understood that true protection required legal structure, not just brute physical strength. The sovereign set his pen aside and picked up a slender stick of crimson sealing wax. He held the end over the bright flame of a single taper candle, rotating the stick slowly until the hard tip began to gloss, blister, and soften. Nellie watched the chemical transformation in silence, her gaze tracing the steady, highly controlled movement of his scarred hands. He did not spill a single drop prematurely onto the pristine desk. When the wax reached the precise melting temperature, he shifted his wrist, allowing a heavy, perfectly round pool of crimson to fall beside their paired signatures. Before the puddle could begin to cool and harden, he pressed the heavy gold signet ring from his right index finger deep into the center. He held it there for 3 long seconds, letting the intense heat transfer into the cold metal, letting the seal cure permanently against the fibers of the vellum. He lifted the ring. The royal crest stood raised, sharp and flawless in the hardened wax. The Freedom Charter was complete. Nellie looked down at the freshly bound agreement. The contract said convenience. It said temporary. It said no emotional entanglements, no personal questions, no crossed boundaries. Yet, as she watched the wet ink of Alistair's name slowly dry into the parchment, the rigid definitions of those words began to shift into something entirely different. The boundaries written on this paper were not walls designed to keep her trapped or subservient. They were iron walls designed to keep the rest of the world out. Her future was entirely secure, protected by a husband whose administrative law was as absolute as his intellect. Alistair stood, rolling the thick parchment carefully before sliding it into a protective, brass-capped leather cylinder. He sealed the container and handed it directly to her. It was heavy, solid, and undeniably real in her grasp. "The remaining volumes of your father's archives will be transferred to the Eastern Wing by morning," he stated, his voice low, lacking any subtle demand for gratitude or praise. "You will have the only key." "Thank you," she answered, her tone perfectly even, though a quiet, unfamiliar warmth had begun to radiate steadily through her chest. He merely inclined his head, turning his attention away from her and toward the large stone hearth at the far end of the room. A robust fire crackled behind the iron grate, consuming thick logs of dry pine and throwing long amber shadows across the endless rows of ancient bookshelves. The bitter northern wind battered against the high leaded glass windows, a distant freezing howl that only emphasized the absolute safety within these thick walls. Nellie stood, carrying the leather cylinder toward the fire. She took a seat in the high-backed velvet armchair nearest the hearth, resting her hands over the smooth surface of the document container. Alistair took the chair opposite hers. He did not attempt to close the physical distance between them. He did not demand her attention, nor did he expect her to fill the quiet air with needless conversation. He simply sat in the warmth of the fire, opening a separate ledger of his own, allowing the quiet domestic rhythm to settle over them naturally. The loud, chaotic machinery of her past had been entirely dismantled by a single unsealed registry. There would be no more forged debt ledgers, no more screaming accusations in grand public halls, no more threats of forced exile from a jealous stepsister. Genevieve was already gone, erased from the official ledgers of the pack, facing the brutal reality of the freezing northern salt flats. Here, in the quiet golden glow of the burning pine, there was only the steady scratch of a turning page, the lingering scent of melting wax, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a recorded truth. Nellie leaned back into the velvet cushions, letting the deep tension finally drain from her shoulders, knowing her future was perfectly, undeniably secure.